We can't not do it, right? Right. We were in the middle of a brilliant conversation. I have to press record. He's back. It's been a long time, well overdue. Richard Shorter, non-perfect dad. Great to have you back on the show.
Mate, it's been brilliant. I've really appreciated Talent Equation and Stu's support over the years. And yeah, we do have some great conversations. So I'm glad you found that little red button.
We've done the classic thing of we've started chatting, and the next thing, we're half an hour in and we're having an amazing conversation and I haven't pressed record. Ridiculous, right? So here we are. We'll come back to it. We've narrowed our time. We're going to have to be super focused. Quick recap. I can't remember how long it was since you were last on, far too long, but
Yeah.
a little bit about you and what's been going on, just to catch everybody up.
Well, so my name's Richard Shorter. I wear two hats. I'm a Baptist church minister in the heartland of Essex in Upminster, and I run I'm the non-perfect dad, and non-perfect dad has the privilege of going into schools, sports organisations, to help parents, coaches, and young people have better conversations within each other within that kind of athletic triangle they technically call it. On LinkedIn, I call myself a conversation architect, and all that simply means is lots of architects get in touch with me and say, "What buildings have you designed recently?" So it doesn't kind of backfires. But that is genuinely, I want to help there be better conversations, not just better thinking, but actually practically into behaviour. What does that look like? What does it look like to give kids better experiences in their sports journey? What does it look like to be collaborative between parent, coach, and young person? And how do we help those conversations happen in a more honest, helpful way, which helps the kid take their sport as far as they can, both in personal development and helps institutions and parents take what they already want to do. I believe most institutions and parents really want to help their kids thrive as human beings, um, and yet sometimes some of that pressure, some of the cultural misunderstandings around sport and high performance get in the way of those conversations being helpful and useful for young people.
And we're definitely going to touch on that because that's a big area that we want to talk about today, a little bit about some of the narratives around performance. But before I jump into that, a number of years ago, one of the things that brought us together, amongst many things, you'd written a great book called Conversations for the Journey. And I just wanted to let you know that I know writing books is a labor of love, and I've threatened to do one several times and never quite made it. So, although I'm very close. So, watch this space. Um, but that book's actually been really beneficial to me in so many ways, and our conversations that we've had subsequently, either like this or when we recorded or when we haven't recorded, or just generally, have been super beneficial because, as you know, I coach my kids. I've got uh, I've got two young, they're getting increasingly old now, 17, 13, moving their way through the various different worlds of sport and physical activity and having the trials and tribulations and the inevitable challenges that come their way. And in particular with my son, who's, starting to now branch into the idea of how do I go down a career route and all these sorts of things. We've had an awful lot of car journeys. And we've had an awful lot of those kinds of conversations. And many of the insights in your book have popped into my mind during some of those more difficult moments, where we've had that disappointing moment or we've had some behavioral issues that need to be addressed. Most recently, in fact, I'll just tell you a very quick story because I think it's useful, hopefully. Um, my son, he's pushing now. He wants to get into the first team, and he'd be quite a young player to get into first team and play at national league level, but he's right on the edge, right on the edge. And he he had a game where I was the coach on the sideline, and he'd actually played pretty well, but then made a couple of mistakes later on in the game, and he basically had a strop. He threw his stick away. He got off, said, get me off, I'm rubbish," and then stood on the bench. And I was like, "Wow, crazy." I'm not sure you would have done that if anybody else had been stood here on the sideline. You're taking advantage of the fact that I'm here. So, needless to say, our conversation on the way home was an interesting one. But I had a number of things I had you in my head when I was having that conversation about how do I handle this discussion. Now, I'll be honest with you, it was a tough conversation,
Mm.
but it wasn't in any way right, this is the kind of conversation you're going to dread. It was a conversation around, I just want you to reflect on some of your behavior, and I want you to reflect on how you think that would have, come across to anybody observing. I think you also want to think about, whether you would have done something like that if somebody else had been here. Just a few thoughts that you want to just go away with. Understand that, he took it on board, to be fair. Here's the interesting thing, though. A few weeks later, he'd managed to do really well, and he was on the edge of selection for the first team, and he was really excited about it. And a few players had said to him, "Look, you might get in here," and he was getting pretty, keen, and he didn't make it. And the coach gave him some feedback on a WhatsApp and a number of different things. But one of the things was, I was watching that day when you threw your stick and got off the sideline, and I've got a bit of a question about your mentality and whether you're ready for this level. Now, talk about a lesson learned.
Hmm.
But it was really interesting nonetheless and so afterwards, instead of me just saying, I told you so, that again had another moment where it was more a question of, so what do we now do with that? How do we channel that forwards to then work out the way we're going to operate going forward, knowing that there's always a pair of eyes on you every single moment of all time, and you're being evaluated all the time when you go down this journey towards performance. So it's just an interesting lesson that we learned there about, or I learned a little bit about, kind of the conversations that we need to have with our kids as we're traveling to and from places.
But the fact that you didn't say "I told you so" in that story is, I think, probably
God,
the
I
best.
can't tell you how hard it was though.
Oh, mate, I know, and I think this is because that "I told you so" is the kind of that inner teen of you wanting to win the conversation. "Oh, I told you, I was right. I've got
100%.
points. Dad knows something," and I think that is, for me, that's the crux of the whole sport parent journey, is how we regulate ourselves. Not to say we're not emotional, like you say, acknowledging. I really wanted to say that, and it's a very normal response, a very normal reaction. It's not doesn't make you a bad parent for wanting to get to kind of have some proof in the bank with your child that you are wise and all powerful. But the the challenge is, how do we as sports parents, and it's the same for coaches, how do we be the adults in the room to be the most helpful to the young people that we're working with in that? One of the things that doesn't sit comfortably with him is that I'm profoundly dyslexic and I really love poetry, and those two things don't tie up particularly well. But in T.S. Eliot's Four Quarters, he talks about like conversations, and one of the phrases he uses when trying to articulate, he talks about an undisciplined squads of emotion. Undisciplined squads of emotion. And I think like the crux of being a sports parent is, how do you roll with those undisciplined squads of emotion that are inside you doing all sorts of things like, oh no, did the coach see that? What does the coach think of you? What does the coach think of me as your parent that I let you do that? Why did my child let themselves down? Do they not realize? If you can master, most of the time, because no one's perfect, hence non-perfect dad, if you can master those undisciplined squads of emotions, or at least roll with them in a way that you can continue to be helpful with your child and their coach in those processes. And it's because it's the same thing about, oh, my child's not been selected. I'm going to message that coach. I'm going to talk to that coach. Part of me wants to ask you, how did you respond to that coach's thing? Did you go and talk to the coach? There's another undisciplined squad of emotion going, do I talk to them? Do I not? What's the best thing to do? My son took a year out last year and went to Australia, went to play for a very famous team in Sydney in their Colts program, and they looked after them horrendously. And the only two things that helped us as parents get through, one, Russell Earnshaw's son was at the club as well. So Rusty and I were able to go, is your son having this experience? Yeah, my son is. So we knew it wasn't personal. And my son knew it wasn't personal because he was able to see other players were getting treated worse than him. But just really unprofessional environment, really unfair and unkind to a bunch of lads the other side of the world. And I had so many undisciplined squads of emotion rolling through me, like, how do I support my son? Do we message the club? What do we do about that? How do I be the adult in the room to help another adult, because he was 18 at the time, process this, especially when he would ring us at the end of his day, which was the start of our day, all in a fluster, understandably upset, wanting to offload. And then that would torpedo our day because we'd be worried about our son. Or he'd ring us first thing in the morning, or his morning, which would be our last thing at night, saying, I haven't slept, I'm really anxious, I don't know how today's going to go. And then I'd have to try and go to bed on those undisciplined squads of emotion. And yet, like leaning in on all the non-perfect dad stuff to try and be helpful. I think I was helpful. I think there were definitely conversations that I weren't as helpful as I could have been. But for me, that is the crux of what I'm trying to do at Non-Perfect Dad, is to try and help parents and coaches think about the practical ways in which they might be helpful in those moments when they want to lean in on old habits that would be unhelpful. Well-meaning, but unhelpful.
Yeah, and I that that was why it was so useful for me. And when you've written a book like that, and it was a while ago when you wrote that, it's easy to forget some of those things. But some of those things, those conversations we've had, and the conversations in the book, have been really useful. And again, often we do things like storytelling, like we're just doing now, or we sharing experiences or whatever it is, and those things have actually stayed with me, from a learning standpoint, more so than if I were to um, have done something, have gone to an online workshop or done a course or something like that. It was interesting because those things have really been quite powerful. But equally, the thing for me was, yeah, I like this idea of squads of emotion. And that's the problem, you see, is too easily. I think it would be very easy be to respond purely based on your emotional response, which may or may not be something positive. What you're able to do is you kept me, or your teachings, I suppose, kept me mindful of where my state was. Something that Mark Bennett and I talk about a lot is understanding your state, and then understanding what's what's a way of approaching this. And so being a bit more mindful of the way you're going to approach the conversation rather than just launching into it with whatever emerges from, kind of that emotional world. That, sometimes it's brilliant, but other times it can be, I know for me anyway, if I just purely and simply go with that sort of that emotional side of me, yeah, that can be hit and miss. Let's put it that way.
One of the games that I like to play with people, because I think, during my sessions, we try and have lots of conversations. And one of the things I like to say is like, here's a conversation. Your child's just been dropped, or your child hasn't been selected for the first team, or they've been released from this Cat 1 football club or whatever. Now make this conversation, buddy up with someone in the room. One of you play the child, one of you be the adult. We'll swap it over. Now make this the worst conversation possible. Like, be the worst kind of parent that you can be in that moment, because then that's fun and people enjoy playing the caricature. It gives people permission maybe to mirror some of the behaviors they know they have done, but because it's in a playful game, they don't feel shamed or anything like that. What is fascinating from those conversations, as well as the kind of laughter as we feed back what people said, well, that's it, there's no dinner, all that money I've invested, people kind of come up with real extremes, is people start to see the thread of, oh yeah, that's that emotion completely unregulated.
Mm,
That's like 10 out of 10 on regulation, or 0 out of 10 regulation, depending on how you do the scale. But I recognize sometimes I'm a 4 or 5 on that scale. What might I do differently? And then we practice the conversation about how you might be really helpful in there, and helping people think that through. I did a session for a Cat 1 Academy Football Club recently for the under 11s. Now, some of those parents are facing release, but it was a really sticky session because not because the parents weren't engaged, because they were great parents, but they hadn't really had any football trauma with their kids yet. So there's me saying, oh, this is going to be painful, it's going to hurt. But they didn't recognize that yet. So at least in kind of playing those games and working through that, and it was interesting that the parents with older children had moments of deep pain with their older children, not necessarily around football, but not necessarily getting the GCSE results they'd wanted or whatever. And helping parents think like that. Whereas sometimes I think some of the parent education that's out there doesn't recognize that for some parents, they actually haven't had that very painful moment of seeing their child heartbroken. The thing I get emailed more about than anything else is my child's out injured or my child's been dropped. Those are the email. What's your best advice? My child's really sad. How do I stop them being sad? Because parents are then experiencing for the first time their child in that deep pit of despair, and they want to try and snap them out of it. Now, my advice is like, oh, that sucks. And actually, just make them a cup of tea, check in with them, give them permission to speak to you, but don't force them to speak to you. And if they're still like this in 2 weeks' time, then you might want to contact the GP or someone at school and try and get them to check in on them. But it's okay that they're in that pit of despair. But parents who haven't experienced that, particularly when you're like talking to under 11 parents, aren't ready to think about those undisciplined squads of emotion. And yet, at least through playing the game and having the conversation, you're starting to prepare them to thinking like, oh, actually, I could behave like that. Oh, that is a possibility. Maybe that would be more helpful. Maybe that wouldn't be.
mm, yeah. I mean, I like that idea about regulation. Actually, that's an interesting idea. Because what you're not wanting to do is to not be an emotional being. It's not as if we're going to try and be, a kind of a monk, and that's impossible. And actually, the it's impossible because you're emotionally driven. Why? Because these human beings are the most important things in the
Exactly.
world to you. You're bound to react in that way. Yeah, it's more about having the filter through which to have the conversation. Sometimes you see, for me, I mean, I think on the one hand, helping them through adversity. I've had a number of moments in my kind of parenting life, I suppose, where I've had a decision to make, almost like which door do I go down? And one can be, because every part of me is throw the arms round, and protect and hug and go after the people who've caused the pain and challenge and what the hell and this, that, and the other. Um, it reminded me of an interesting experience I had recently, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But there's been other times when I've gone, so that's my instinct. But what I've actually done is gone, how can we use this? What can we do? Let's reflect and think about why this might have arrived and the reasons which. And then sometimes there's some honest reflection required. Weren't doing the training, weren't being committed enough, weren't following through on what we said we were going to do, all those sorts of things. So there's something valuable to be, and no amount of and in fact, I deliberately tried to sort of stay quite out of like my kids' lives in the sense of I want them to make some decisions. Now, they're probably sometimes going to make some decisions that aren't the right decisions, and therefore they're going to have to learn some hard lessons. But I actually do believe that sometimes those hard lessons have real profound value, more so than me just badgering them. You've got to do this, you've got to do the other. Because if they're doing it through compliance, because I told them to, I don't believe that's necessarily going to give them the value. But it also means I have to allow them sometimes to have hardship. And I believe that some of those life lessons are really valuable for them and will stay with them and be useful and resourceful. But then what I then do is then act then as the kind of coach alongside them and act as a little bit of a guide to try and say sometimes, right, yes, I'm obvious. I'm not that hard that I'm not going to, give them encouragement and support and emotional, and throw the arms around them. But there's also times I say, yeah, we've also got to look at this uncritically and honestly, and then work out if this is something you do not want to happen again, and you also are deciding that you're still going to pursue this track. What is it we can learn from it to minimize the chances of reoccurrence? And let's also consider what we're going to now do to go forward and the things that we're going to, kind of address and challenge and all those sorts of things. Now, that's sometimes a very difficult thing to do. Um, but I find that quite, and I found that a number of times because my protection instinct kicks in. So yeah, it's an interesting one, but that's because I can regulate,
Yeah.
even though my instincts are saying go after the people who created the hardship and rage against the machine and actually throw love and affection around my child. I don't do all of that because I believe there's some things that they can benefit from. I do see a lot of people around me actually who do everything they can to either prevent hardship occurring for their kids or when hardship does occur, go after the people who created the hardship, whoever they are, and kind of like create that sort of snowplow to so that that child never has that difficulty again. And I fundamentally believe that is actually going to create significant downstream problems for that child. I find it extremely difficult to watch. And I take a different approach, but
Well,
everyone's to their own, you know.
well, I think you make two interesting points there. And one is that everyone's to their own, because I think we're in danger. I mean, I would agree with you on all you've just said, and that would hopefully mirror my own parenting as well. I lean very heavily on motivational interviewing. It's not the only way of doing things, but I find it a very useful way, and it talks about being a guide in conversations, and I find that very helpful. Um, uh, and yet parents are still allowed to choose how they parent within like an ethical safeguarding framework. And I think there are kind of sound bites that happen in the parent education world that I feel are ethical type sound bites, but actually don't bear much resemblance to reality, and so become far easier for parents to ignore. And the second thing I want to say is I don't think like how you regulate yourself in those moments is sometimes to have a bit of a script. And And so, like, the conversations for the journey is 40 short scripts that you could use, not prescriptively, but hopefully as a starting point. And there's sometimes as a dad that I lean in on a script because I know I need to use words that I know are helpful now. They're probably not the best words, there might be better words, but because I know inside me is this bubble of emotion that I need to use a script to help me calm down. And it's the same stuff we tell kids with athletes: good breathing, give yourself a bit of space, try and give yourself a minute to calm down. And then for me, I might lean in on a script, not because which is better than just trying to go with the flow when you're in that emotional kind of heightened state of arousal, as it were. But the I think one of the challenges around the ethics is, like, I've seen quite a bit on social media, people saying parents can't want it as much as their children. Their children have got to want it more. And part of me wants to say, yes, completely. Parents can't want it more than their children. And yet, Stuart, I mean, I'm not asking you to name or shame your children here, but I definitely wanted my children to be able to brush their teeth more than they wanted to be able to brush their teeth because I'm an adult. I knew the benefits of that twice daily habit, and I knew that I knew you knew what would come from them embodying that. They had no perception. Did I want my kids to get certain GCSE grades? No, not at all. I wanted them to do their best because I knew that it was a helpful gateway to the next stage of life. I also knew that if they stuffed them all up, that wasn't going to hold them back either, because there are plenty of other paths, and I know plenty of people who've not got any school qualifications and gone on to lead brilliant, impacting lives in many, many, many fields. But when I'm having a discussion about revision, yeah, I've got to be honest with you, Stuart. There are times when I want my kids to revise a lot more than they want to revise. I want it more for them than they do. And then you take somebody who might be in like a Cat 1 football academy who's playing on grass. I mean, when I played football as a kid, the goalmouth was always a swimming pool of mud. I don't know about you, but like these kids who have this brilliant opportunity to experience high level like football academies or rugby academies, they don't know what that they don't know what a muddy goalmouth is. Bless them. There's nothing wrong with that. But they've had such incredible opportunities, and then to say to parents, you looking at all this opportunity, you can't want it more than your kids. Now, the challenge is how that wanting then turns into behavior and what that then looks like in behavior. And you and I might say that if you want it more than your kids and you're really pushy and really driven, that has the potential to do some real harm to your kid, real harm to you and your kid's relationship. And yet, sport is littered with people, Luke Litter, whose parents clearly want it an awful lot and they've made it all the way to the top. And so when we're giving parents this kind of ethical, you can't want it as much as your kids, they only have to look around the winners of Olympic gold medals, Premiership titles, and they're going, oh, their dad wanted it more than they did for most of their life. Their mum wanted it more than they did. David Beckham's dad had him drinking Guinness and having raw eggs every morning. He definitely wanted it more than him. Lewis Hamilton's dad definitely wanted it more than him during the process. Broke their relationship only in his mid-30s, did Lewis say. I'm on board with the ethical decision to say, actually, at a certain point, the kid's got to drive it. But I find it fascinating. We're having this conversation after like Luke Little has won the world championship. Incredible performance, brilliant story, and yet the little snippets that come out about his parents are clearly very driven around his success. Now, I don't know them, I've not met them, that's not a judgment on them, and it's their choice to do that. And as a family unit, they must work that through. But I would say the snippets of stories say that his parents want it the same or at times more than he does. And so we've got to be honest with parents about what we're saying to them in parent education. It is okay if you want it a bit more than your kids. It's how that behavior then impacts and what that looks like. And is that what you're willing to potentially sacrifice or not in that conversation?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And for people who aren't as obsessed with the darts as we are, um, uh, it's something that happens every year in over Christmas time, and it's become a bit of a Christmas tradition now in the UK. The darts is on, and it's now even referred to on TV as Dartsmas, for football Dartsmas, Merry Football Dartsmas, I think it's called. Anyway, so yeah, this like competition lasts for like 3 weeks or so. The prelims before Christmas, and then the finals are done afterwards. And this teenage phenomenon. He got to the final last year out of nowhere. Proper Cinderella story. We love them, don't we?
Mm.
Came out of nowhere. Da, 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 da. He didn't really come out of nowhere, but more or less came out of nowhere. Got to the final, was leading in the final, didn't manage to win it at 16 years old, and this year at 17 years old had beaten one of the greatest players that probably has ever played, um, and did so with a kind of smile on his face and a, a, a gentle sense of frivolity. But it's going to be really interesting to watch what happens now with this young individual. And I haven't really picked up the parental side, to be honest, because I haven't sort of followed that side. I was more following the sort of his journey and his development and got enthralled by it.
Well, there was on the BBC this week. There was his mum saying that 11. She said to him, "You have to stop all sport and just focus on darts. Like this is the thing that you've got to do." He enjoyed his football. There's another professional saying that on another newspaper, loosely newspaper, Daily Mail, which was reporting another professional who was 16 in the world at the time beat Luke Littler when he was 12. Only just beat him when he was 12, which is amazing. And he remembers, this is the quote from the newspaper from the professional. I remember seeing his dad with him. He was dead critical of him because he had just lost. And I was thinking, mate, he's 12 and I was top 16 world at the time. I said, give him a break. And his dad said, no, he needs to learn. Now, that's straight feedback straight after competition. Most coaches in the world would argue that that kind of strong feedback straight after competition is not the most healthy time to give that, let alone to a 12-year-old. No, I'm not. That's not how I would want to parent. I would want to, but then I'm not producing world champions, and that's something that I'm quite happy with for all sorts of reasons. And there's no way of knowing whether that story's completely true or not. So I want to put that out there. I don't know the family, and but his dad is allowed to put him under loads of pressure at 12. I think there are consequences, potential consequences for that. And I wish Luke Littler and his family all the best. And I hope that as they have to navigate some of those things as he turns into a young adult, I hope that they have a good support network around them to be able to navigate that. The challenge is how many other 12-year-olds have been told that by their dad and never go on to be a world champion, and what does that do to those young people's confidence? And you and I both know that 12, 13, 14, we are hemorrhaging kids from taking part in sport. And the way in which parents and coaches talk to their kids is a significant contributory factor to that decline. So for the Luke Littlers and Lewis Hamiltons out there for whom it enabled them to go and win stuff, what is the fallout from that in most family households? And when I go into high performance environments, you can see the parents who are looking at me when I'm saying, uh, think about the long term relationship, things like that. And they just glaze over. They're not thinking about that. They are thinking about the success and the success only. They are allowed to do that. And so I think parent engagement has to be clever and thought through about addressing these issues and helping parents understand that. And I think most parents still want a good kid out of this process, even if they want them to be world champion at whatever kind of sport, and helping give the kids a voice in that journey. Not to say I don't want pressure, but to say actually I want healthy pressure at healthy moments. And my advice to parents is let the coaches navigate that. You're there as their harbour to love them, to listen, to shape, to have the difficult midweek conversations like, oh, let's talk about the stick being thrown or whatever. But or do you want to chat about that? But midweek, assuming that the fixture happens at a weekend, like you say, we love a Cinderella story, and I think if we're going to give parents advice, they can't look on the back pages of the newspapers and see that actually those who are winning all these competitions, their parents were completely different to the advice we were giving.
Well, that's, I suppose, you make an important point, which is, and one of the reasons I like what you do is, you don't moralize about the right way to parent. What you do is you make people aware of the pitfalls of certain approaches, the pros, because pros and cons either way. The, we've had that kitchen table conversation, my wife and I, around, where I remember distinctly when she said to me when I think he was about 11 or 12, given that everything you know and all the stuff you know about talent development and coaching, shouldn't he be better than he is? And I remember it distinctly. It'll stay with me because how do you answer that? Because
You
to be
say
fair, the
he's got your
world.
DNA in him. I can only do so much.
Well, thankfully he has athletically. He's got her athleticism, and I like to think he's got my game sense. But who knows, right? Um, the uh, the the thing I think that's interesting about that is, and this again from the ethical standpoint, and this is why I think it's interesting. I was going to ask you what some of those ethical sound bites are. You can't want it more than you should. I don't believe that's true, by the way. Like you always want everything more than your children do, because to be fair, given a choice, like what would my son do? He'd probably play on PlayStation most of the time, right? It's really enjoyable and it's really immediately gratifying. It's a space of retreat and freedom, and it's a place where he can connect with his friends. And they can't do that sometimes face to face, so it's a place for him to be social. Now, and what I'm trying to say though is that he can't do that all the time because he can't.
No.
There's going to be other times he's going to do some other things because that's the rich tapestry of life. And when we
Yeah.
do that, we want to try and make that experience as good as we possibly can.
And we're
I've made
adult.
a parenting choice. I made a parenting choice that because I had read a lot of this and I understood actually that there are very compelling narratives around youth development, and they're driven often by survivorship bias. So
Mm.
we see kids who become good as phenoms, and we look backwards retrospectively, right, what happened? And we go, that's the root. It happens all the time, and there's no amount of articulating the alternative and actually more often than not true narrative that seems to be able to break through. But I'll continue to try. I made a parenting choice that I didn't want to mortgage my future relationship with my kids because I was going to drive them towards something, even though I have thought about it since. What if I'm wrong? What if this is wrong? What if actually they wanted me to push them? What if they needed me to push them? What if I had to create structure and a regime of training and this, that, and the other that would have turned them into phenomenons, and then they would have gone
Mm.
on for my choice was, if that's what it takes, I don't want that, because my biggest fear was never that they wouldn't become some sort of elite thing. My biggest fear was that it would fundamentally change any future relationship we might have. I would much rather my kids look back and go, my dad did everything he could to support, provide opportunity, be that kind of voice, be that sometimes the challenge, sometimes the arm around the shoulder, but was always there, providing me with that and believed in me and gave me the support to do whatever I want to do, than then say I got here because I had these experiences. I just thought there was too much risk involved. And so if that then means that they don't achieve whatever their so-called potential leads them to, well, so be it. I fundamentally don't believe you have to make that choice, by the way. I do believe that there are benefits to this approach that will come later than traditionally seen. You see, oh, I'm not playing for England at under 16, so I can't be any good. Hang on a second. Look at Sam Ward. Didn't get into the England setup until he was 22, right? 23, right? But became one of our top goal scorers. This is in the world of hockey for people who don't know that, right? So there are routes for everybody, right? Just because you're not here for that. But unfortunately, there's a very insidious world there that's basically telling you this is what you've got to do to get to this point, to get to this point, to get to this point. And it's younger and younger and younger. And I don't particularly like it.
No, and I mean, it makes good points. Yeah, and that's the same decision we've made. And as I reflect, the best bit of Caleb's year out for me, and there were lots of good bits. And his grandma went to visit him, and he was just a brilliant grandson. She was a brilliant grandma. They had a great time together. There's lots of bits that were good. We're sitting down with his mentor, and his mentor's got a 2-year-old, and the toddler was throwing a rugby ball around, and we were just sitting chatting. And the mentor said to Caleb, "Oh, so do you wish you hadn't got out with that team then?" And Caleb kind of took a long pause and went, I wouldn't be the person I am today if I hadn't had that really difficult set of experiences. So if I knew what I knew before, I probably would have made a different decision. But looking back on it now, no, no, it was good for me. It was the right thing to do, and I was like, wow, that is cool. Like if nurturing him and not pushing him and not getting over involved in the external stuff, but being there as his anchor and his harbour and coaching him to be adaptable, coaching him to have difficult conversations through that year at his pace. Even though for us it was like there was a lot of sleepless nights about is he okay and is he doing all right. Actually, the outcome of that, um, I'm thrilled with. I'm absolutely thrilled with. Our middle child is trying to apply to drama school. That's a total drama. And it's a long, long process. And actually, and some people don't get that process. Some people have already said to her, maybe drama school's not for you. And she's like, oh, I've got to take a year out. No, you're not taking a year out. You're doing the next year of prep for drama school. You know it takes 3 or 4 years. This is not a year out. This is just the next year of prep. Keep going. And that's not me pushing. That's because I'm an adult, so I can see the bigger picture. So I want that more for her. And at the same time, I'm going to help her reframe what she wants, because I know that's what deep down that she wants, not what I want for her. And yet it's fascinating watching her say, I don't want to make it to the very top of this game. And I suspect it's the same in sport because most of the top actors and actresses are really unhappy. And so it's kind of fascinating thinking about like listening to those stories of people who make it up. I'm sure there are plenty who are happy, but those lots of people who go on like the high performance podcast, things like what comes across quite clearly is often that they're a pretty miserable time in that very high performance environment. You know, it's so anybody who makes it, I wish them all the best and hope that they've got a great support network around them, but not basing it on that survivor bias and acknowledging that as an adult, of course, I want it more because I'm an adult. I see more than a teenager does. Or certain, I want certain parts of it more, and it's how my behaviors interact. And I think that's where good parent engagement, like the just let's have this conversation in the worst possible way, is helping parents start to see and caricature what's happening. Because at the other end of the scale, Stuart, we have schools who are having more kids turn up in nappies and not being able to tie shoelaces and not being able to get themselves dressed because at the other end of the scale we have so many parents who aren't willing to kind of do the hard bits of parenting with their children, have those difficult conversations. So part of helping parents have conversations, I think we have kind of two extremes in society now. We have those who perhaps push really, really hard, and then we have those who are so afraid of upsetting their kid and that their kid's their best mate and instead of actually saying, no, listen, I mean, tying a shoelace is weird. Velcro's amazing. Let's face it. Tying a shoelace is a weird micro kind of skill to have. There's no easy way. Some kids get it in 2 seconds. Some kids it takes ages. You have to have a persistent, like you can nag them, you can tell them off, you can bribe them, or you can just slowly coach them. And that's so frustrating. It's so hard to do that. And so what we're seeing is parents less and less being willing to do this. So we're seeing schools, bless them, having to pick up on that. And I think that's so harsh on schools. We had a bunch of kids come to church for in year 4 to put a nativity on. And I challenged the parents not to film it because I was like, just receive it. Don't film it. They've prepared this for you. Just receive it. In fairness to the parents, parents took that. Most of them took that on board and didn't film it. I didn't tell them not to film it. I just invited them to like think about like receiving it. And if Granny's not here, then why don't they have a great conversation telling it to Granny and re-singing the songs to Granny? I think Granny would probably prefer that one-to-one than just sing a film. Um, but then when the kids came out, all the parents are like waving to reassure their kid that they're there. And I was like, these are year 4 kids and they're just about to put on a carol service. Like, they don't need reassurance that you're here. They're fine. You're fine. Yeah. And I was like, oh my word. So that for me is at the other end of the spectrum as well, is that kind of, like you say, that kind of wrap it up in cotton wool, snow plowing. I don't want my kid to not think I'm not here, so I'm just going to wave at them. And of course, no one wants their kid to be upset or feel left out or feel like their parent. It comes from a well-meaning place. And yet, I worry for this generation of kids that either they've got kids, parents who are pushing them really, really hard, or they've got parents who are just kind of, I'm here, don't worry, everything's going to be all right at every opportunity, instead of, because most kids will probably just want to go and play outside and chill out anyway and be very happy that their parents aren't there.
I mean, that's the point. I mean, you can't protect, like you've just chosen to put that there with your son. I always sometimes think it's a bit pointless to sort of look backwards and say, do you wish you hadn't? It happened. The question is, what do we do with that? And I actually think his response is, you probably wouldn't say this, but I think his response is testament to, the parenting choices that you've made in terms of like who he is as a human and how he can respond to these kinds of difficulties. I think if he hadn't had the kinds of resources and skills that you've provided him through your parenting and through the guidance that you've given, I think that may have been a much more destructive experience for him. Um, my question with all of these things is whenever you have these sorts of difficult experiences, which are inevitable, by the way, they are an inevitable part of life. You can't necessarily choose whether they happen or not. What you can choose, though, is how you deal with them. And you can choose to frame them in a certain way and have them define you, or you can choose to frame them in a different way. And that's been one of the ways that I've been trying to articulate this to to my kids. I had a recent conversation with my daughter where she was basically talking about expectation, and she had a feeling that I had very, very high expectations um, for her, and she wasn't matching up to her brother, who was better at this than her. And I said, but you've got your own strengths. And but the biggest message was, I said, the only thing I expect of you, the only thing is that you try your hardest and you do your best. I've said that since you were tiny. Just try your hardest and do your best. That's all I've ever said. Whatever that brings is whatever it brings. I'm still going to love you forever, right? Um, and so I don't care what you do and what you achieve. I only care that you try your hardest and do your best and you're happy. And afterwards, it was probably one of those proper emotional after dinner type of conversations. And she said to me, she said, "Oh, thanks, Dad. I really needed that." It was like a proper moment. And then she toddled off like it was nothing. And I'm left there just like, crushed. Oh my God, what happened there? But anyway, look, I'm conscious that we run
Well, I
out of
think
time.
the challenge is that our kids pick up stuff from us that is then misinterpreted. There's loads of great research out there that says that, and then there's the external factors as well. One of our children had a terrible year six SATs experience. For those not in the UK, there's a school testing system in year six, which is meant to be about how the schools are doing, not about the individual children. But one of my children, they had a terrible year six SATs experience where the teacher just put them all under so much pressure from dot one, and then labeled a bunch of them unable to handle the pressure. So put them in a pressure group, which was just really weird. And then yeah, it was just it really frustrated us because we spent the whole time SATs don't matter. It's nothing to do with you. It's just about the school. Just be chill. That was our messaging all the way through. She was like, "Oh, we've got to do loads of practice." We're like, "No, it's up to you." We weren't didn't put her under any pressure to do any of that. Um, and then when they went to secondary school, every teacher in year seven said, "Brilliant kid, does really, really well, can't handle exams." We're like, "Yeah, we know, because in year six, they had this adult experience." And as parents, we've spent the last 5 or 6 years helping them unpack that and work through that. And there's nothing you can do as parents. They will sometimes have brilliant coaches or teachers or whatever, and you will have to deal with the fallout. That's part of parenting. They'll go on later in life to have relationships and partners that some will thrive with, some will wound them, and you'll have to help them nurture through that. And if you can continue to be the adult in the room, have good spaces, to offload, like you were saying about your frustration, that's where you do need a mate at the end of the phone call. That's where particularly us blokes need to get better at some of that stuff of just really making, "Oh, you won't believe what the club's done or said." Just vent to somebody so that when you have the conversation with your kid, you're not venting your frustration through that conversation. One of the fun things that I've been playing around with is scorecards recently, because I think everyone's a bit competitive, aren't they? And I've got a "don't be that sports parent" scorecard, which is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of, because we all know that sports parent. We've all seen them on the sideline and we've gone, "Oh, don't do that." So just trying to help parents reflect on what that sports parents might look like, and just having a bit of tongue-in-cheek playing. Because I mean, like I say, if parents want to wave at their kids when they come into the nativity, that's their choice. I'm just trying to help people think about like what might be the impact of that, and how is that being helpful or not helpful. And again, I think the danger with sports parenting is it isn't soundbitey. Like there isn't, like I said, I lean in on some scripts, but I wouldn't want to give parents this is the script to turn your child into X, Y, Z, because it doesn't exist, because every encounter is different. It's got to be led by you and the child. And so I think institutions would do well to think about some of the sound bites they're giving, because parents just intuitively know when someone says, "You can't want it more than your kid," they go, "Oh, well, that's a load of rubbish." They might not articulate that, but internally they go, "Well, that's weird. Why are you saying that?" I understand what they mean by that is you can't put them under multiple tons of pressure because you might break the relationship. But actually, you can put them under multiple tons of pressure and still produce a world champion, even if your relationship or that person is deeply unhappy as a result. And I suspect there are examples out there of people who put their kids under tons of pressure and the kids fine and happy as well, by the way. I mean, I
There are
suspect
ways, by the way, there are ways of doing that that don't require that kind of, um,
completely.
yeah, it's not a trade-off. Um,
No,
Listen, I'm conscious that we're running up on time, and you've got very important things to do in your ministry. And it's my fault because I've rambled on far too long for good reason. So we'll definitely book in a part two. because there's a million jumping off points that you've just put into my brain. Quickly though, I wonder if people might have found value in this conversation and might want to connect and reach out or attend one of the multiple seminars, webinars that you're doing. And it may well be that there's a collaboration here where we do more regular stuff like this. But anyway, how do people get in touch?
Thanks, mate. Richard at non-perfectdad.co.uk is the email address. Website, you can work it out from that. And then I'm on LinkedIn, Richard Shaw. It'd be great to connect and have value. And also, just come and challenge Stu and I. If if there's stuff that we've said that you think's unfair or misrepresented, join the conversation because that'll give us a launch point for part two. We'd love to hear people give an alternative view or an alternative understanding of this. That would help our thinking as well. So, mate, thanks for your support. And as ever, yeah. I think we've both got brains that jump off in lots of different places. Our mutual friend Sky Buscemi, she says when she's talking to me, she has to really keep me on the road because she knows my brain is going to zing. So between the two of us, it's a good job we've got a time constraint, I think.
Anyway, thanks, mate, and I'll speak to you again soon.
Cheers, mate. Bye.